Today my task is to do something kind of difficult, which is to like walk through a lecture of something that we're not going to do super often or get a lot of practice doing uh, for like a chunk of time after we first get some practice in it. So, what we're going to talk about doing is using Rails as an API for our front end, which sometimes we're going to be able to configure from the ground up. Other times, people are going to give us like a Rails backend because they just want to focus on practicing JavaScript like as a unit. But when we're working on projects, right, like that's where building a backend Rails API is going to matter, right? And a lot of our Rails skills are going to come back into play. And what we're going to find is that coming back to Rails after working on JavaScript, and then later on coming to the point of like the end of Mod 4 after working on React and having a Rails backend there, and then once again for like a Mod 5 final project. And then maybe you're studying like Java or something like that after you graduate for a couple of months, and then you have to come back and do Rails again. So what is like a strategy that could work? What's a pattern that could help us deal with the dual challenges of learning a new thing, but also being able to put it into our back pocket the second that we learn it, because we can't expect to get a whole lot of muscle memory from rapid repetitions over and over. So to that end, I've created a README that's supposed to kind of serve as like a standing guide for a lot of this stuff and talk through some of those things the same way that I'm about to talk through them today. And so hopefully you can use the code from this lesson as like a repeated resource to revisit as you go through other stuff where your Rails is going to be a backend. What I'd like to do is kind of start by looking at Shirtsy, which is like our Rails app that we had from before, right? With like shirt sales, and just kind of examine like the shape of this controller real quick, because we've got like an index, right? And whenever we hit the index route, that means that we're going to render this shirt index. And we have this like link to method that knows how to draw a URL for us. Over here we have like a new where we have a render partial, like that's like a syntax that's very specific to like a concern of a Rails view, we could say. In the form that we're rendering, we have this like form for, we know about those, we remember those. Still might be rattling us even like a week into Mod 3, our memories of like wrestling with these from time to time. But we have these form generators, like all this stuff is like view logic, right? But this really matters to us mainly if we want Rails to be in charge of drawing all of our views for us, and we don't always want that, right? Sometimes we have a single page app where we'd rather have like a front end tool do the templating and then just have data come back from the controller. So by default, our controller here is set up to do like render some views, right? That's basically like we're going to render a view, we're going to render a view, we're going to render a view. Here we say like redirects, which like keeps it from doing the default thing, which would be to go to the end of the method and render a view. But that means that we also have to carry all of this stuff involving like link tos and form fors and stuff like that gets kind of heavy, right? It's kind of bulky. If my main concern is just to use Rails as an API, as a backend way to serve up JSON, think about like those JSON server files, right? We really just have like stores of JSON objects. Like sometimes we have arrays, sometimes they're nested within each other, but we just have keys and values, right? If we just had the ability to serve those back from these controllers, that might be a really useful thing, right? Like we could say here, let's go to our Shirtsy. Yeah, so we'll say Rails S, fire up a server real quick. Once we got that poppin', we'll get on localhost 3K /shirts. Yeah. Let's see. Maybe I was just a little fast. Yeah, there's our shirts, right? All shirts. Great. So this is cool, right? We're like looking at shirts. By the way, like what we're really looking at is shirts.html, right? Because this server is like built to return HTML. I believe that we have like choices in a Rails controller. So I can say Rails controller respond with JSON. Because we can respond to a request for HTML in our controller right now, but we can also do this kind of thing. We can also render if the format of the response that's requested is not HTML, but is JSON. So we can say here format.html, we want to render index, right? This is the question that they have, right? I just really want to show this as two things. Because it's actually their question, but it's my answer for now. This is exactly how I wanted to see it. Format.json. Let's render JSON for something called shirts. right? Which means I guess we still need shirts here. We should probably set that up top. So we're always going to call shirts from the database, but now sometimes we're going to render the index about the shirts, and sometimes if the JSON format is requested, we're going to attempt to do this thing called render JSON, which will turn shirts, the array of objects, into JSON of like their attributes, and show us that as like JSON. Let's see what this looks like. Shirts.json. Boom. Oh no, too few arguments. Yeah, so I missed something in my syntax here. Let me go back and look at an actual answer. Yeah, responds to. Oh, that's right. I missed the context of all of the stuff that we're talking about. Format is not a thing unless we talk about this in the context of a response that we're trying to do. Respond to some sort of format. Let's try this out. Yeah, check that out. ID 4, blue, image nothing, price 10, yellow, teal, sample JPEG 16. Isn't that kind of neat, right? Like, this is the data that we would need from the JSON server if we wanted to create like a front end, like interactive shirts app. If I wanted to have like full interactivity and being able to like show like little loading spinners when stuff's happening and nobody has to hit the back button in their browser ever because like they're just where they need to be, right? So we don't necessarily need to have the ability to render HTML in order to render JSON, right? You can also decide to just like render JSON from a server and have that be like the only thing that that server does, right? If we just go to shirts without an HTML option, and this is a problem now because it says unknown format, and because when my browser goes and makes this request right now, it's trying to make an HTML request. So if I was making this via JavaScript fetch, it would be making a JSON request instead by default. So my browser won't work with this until I have something like fired off, preventing my browser from doing something, but maybe that would be a JSON request going from a JavaScript thing. We'll cover that at the end. Right now, I'm going to let this ride. What I want to get into is this idea of an app called Zookeeper, where we're going to have Rails working as a backend, and then we'll also have a front end working, and then we'll branch off from this backend where I'm going to keep the README for future use and use Zookeeper as like your sample app to play and practice with after this. So here's the README in the Zookeeper backend, and as we go, we're going to build some other stuff outside of this app as we practice. So our goals today, we want to return RESTful responses from a Rails backend as we always have. This time, instead of HTML, we need to return JSON data like I just demonstrated from a given endpoint. So we need to think about situations where a JSON API might be appropriate and recognize like when we'd want to do something like this in real life. And then review and continue to understand more about the HTTP request response cycle. There's a bunch of resources at the bottom of this document, and when you actually view this in the browser, which I think I should just do right now, open to the side. Yeah, let's reveal this in Finder. Yep. Open with, oh my goodness, it's always a chore. Other, and then I probably am going to have, yeah, recommended applications. No, all applications. They really make you work for it. And I have to go up here and search for Chrome because like they don't alphabetize. Sure, why not? It's fine. Click on this. It's not known, but I know. It's known to me. Relax your face. All right, cool. So this is like, we can click on this and then it'll take you to an actual resource, like in terms of how this really runs if you open it up in a browser. So in terms of using this as a developer, I'm going to keep it open, almost like documentation that links to other documentation. And I'd recommend you do the same if you want to use this as like a study sheet as you want to practice building Rails APIs from scratch. So today we're going to talk about like reviewing a Rails project, which we kind of just did, talking about responding to JSON. We've covered that. We're going to talk more about JSON as a benefit. We're going to talk more about request responses, making a fetch request, and finally we're going to discuss something called cores. It's not Ice Delicious, it's something else, but Always Sunny fans, strap in anyway. It's going to be a good time. So if we make a new Rails app, like we mentioned, we get this Form 4 stuff, right? We get a whole lot of stuff, which is called like Action View. It's this big bulky gem that's included with Rails to do all of our view stuff, but if we're doing Rails as an API, we don't actually want it. The reason that we'd like to have JSON instead is because it is agnostic. Like Python has dictionaries, Ruby has hashes, JavaScript has JSON, other languages have other names for this, but we have this ability to nest things inside of a key value based structure, that it has fast lookup generally in the languages that implement them. We call them hashes in Ruby. That's what we've been using. And when we want to pass these things around over the web, we pass them all as strings, right? And so a lot of languages have a way to take a hash-like thing and turn it into a string so that it can travel over the web. So in this case, like it recommends here, if I'm practicing alone, let's open a Rails console and find a record of choice to demonstrate what I'm talking about here. Like if I'm in Shirtsy, I can shut down my server. Let's talk about to.json and what this is actually going to look like under the hood. So, because yeah, even in the browser, what we see is something that's kind of been reconstructed by the browser. So let's see what actually to.json returns under the hood. I'm going to call like shirt.first and look at like one shirt. Shirt.first, shirt.first.to.json. Whoa, it's like Jon Stewart from Half Baked. Have you ever tried that object on JSON? And it's like, check it out, because like the first character is like a quote character, right? And so this whole thing is a string. And so it's like quote, brackets, and then like escape quote, quote, or escape character quote, because it needs to say like ID quotes, like, because this is the key name and it has to be preserved as quotes. So we've got escape characters for every single time we need to use quotes inside of the string so that there's no confusion about where the string actually ends. If I were to delete a single one of these, I'd be screwed, right? I couldn't read the response. I couldn't put it back together. So yeah, you basically have this ability when we call .to.json to break down a given Ruby object, turn it into its attributes, and put the attribute name as the key and the attribute value as the actual value. So yeah, like it would be very, very cool if our interface could be used on a web version and a mobile version, right? Like if the data about all the index of shirts is coming to the front end, and then I have a nice front end language that's like concerned with like, if the device is mobile, I have all these buttons that I'd put here and all this other stuff, but the data that I'm placing is the same. And if it's like a tablet, then I do some different stuff with my styling. So thinking about separating the concern of like where the data comes from versus like how we decide to display the data in different contexts. So once we can break off the data and deal with it in like this JSON format, that gives us that opportunity. It frees us up a little bit. So yeah, we can respond to HTML and JSON as we just saw here, and that's just generally the context, the syntax that we do. We do the respond to block, and then within that we say format dot. We can almost think of this as like a form builder for our controller response, right? Very similar syntax. We pass in objects for our what we're gonna sorry, not an object, but a block. What the block returns is going to be what the HTML response is. What this block returns is going to be what our JSON response is. So yeah, we've seen the HTML to JSON conversion. I do think that that's very, very cool. There's also this cool flag, right? I think we found out so far that like with Rails new, we can do a -d flag to create a new app with like a Postgres database, right? With Rails new -d PostgreSQL, and that'll create a new Rails app that's already configured with a Postgres database. And then you don't have to like follow the rabbit hole down to like manually convert SQL to Postgres. Or we could say skip active storage if we don't want all of the active storage routes to show up in our Rails routes, right? We could also add --API if we'd like to make the app without any sort of concern of views or anything like that. So what I'd like to do is make a sample API real quick. I'm going to get out of the Shirtsy folder, just back up. I'm going to say Rails new snails. It's going to be the name of the app. I'm going to call it actually Snoopy on snails. It's going to be Snoopy is like a cartoon character that doesn't exist, but he's like teaches kids about science and bugs. That's what I've decided just now. --API. So I want to make it API. And then I could say like -database. Let's make it a Postgres database. Why not? And then also like, let's do that. Skip active storage. And we could also like skip action mailer. So I don't need to worry about mailer routes either. So like a lot of times when we run Rails new, it's more flags than the actual definition of the app itself. But very typically when you're making a new Rails app, you're thinking about like one of the flags, but you're putting in a lot of other flags that you've learned over time are just useful for you. So consider like adding something like that to your flow, or creating a cheat sheet maybe for like Rails new flags and what they do. And even in the act of creating the cheat sheet, you develop memory that way too. So if I say --API here, let's see what we get. Oh no, invalid value. Sure, I said Postgres, but I think it's supposed to be PostgreSQL. They're sticklers about that kind of stuff here, Rails. Sweet. Making a bunch of various stuff in my app. Yeah, Okay, she on. All right, Rails routes. All right, so we run Rails routes, usage, Rails. Oh no, sorry, I can't do Rails. I'm not in the thing. We need a CD into the app before we can say Rails routes, right? CD Snoopy on snails. Rails routes. I just wanted to see if I have the active storage routes and the action mailer routes. I don't think I'm gonna, because we skipped them, right? We don't have any routes to find. Woohoo! So by skipping action mailer and active storage, I have like the nice clean Rails routes output that I love to have, which is going to be super helpful as like we're trying to figure out like JSON routing and stuff. Let's go back to our README now that we've made the new API and see what we're supposed to be like looking at, right? Let's look at some differences. Let's look at app views inside of this app. What I usually see in app views, right, would be like subfolders for stuff, and we'd have like the layout, right? We'd have like app views layout, like in our shirtsy, if I've got that here somewhere still. App views, even before we create our first views, there's this layouts, right? We have application HTML ERB, we had this mailer stuff when we did have action mailer as our default, and then of course any subfolders that we'd add with views. Let's check out what's happening in Snoopy on Snails. So we open the code up and look at our app/views folder. App. Guess not. Well, that would be one difference, right? If this is just an API, its job is not to render any views. So I'm not getting a views folder by default. I don't have any sort of like layout stuff here. There's nothing there to speak of because that's not the concern of an API to render views. Yeah, same rate commands, Jason. It just has different config settings. So if I go to my, I think it's maybe not DB, config database.yaml, I get some different default settings here. Instead of talking about SQLite databases, now I have adapter PostgreSQL. There's something called pool that needs to be involved for some reason. I'm not sure exactly why. But yeah, the database still gets the same kind of name. It's just that the adapter changes from SQLite to PostgreSQL. And then there's also like a gem called PG that gets added to your bundle when you get into your gem file. We're using PG for the Postgres database instead of SQLite 3. So those are only a few changes between them. No, SQL, yeah. Active Record works with any relational database that you can speak SQL to, and PostgreSQL is just another flavor of a SQL database, kind of like SQLite or MySQL would be different flavors of SQL. So it's kind of like they're both databases are primarily SQL databases, and we're able to use SQL on both of those, so Active Record works either way, with either kind of style. So far we've only used SQLite because like we haven't needed anything more complex than like a local database file, but typically a database is run on something resembling a server so that you can run a database remotely on a service like Heroku and trust that whatever service computer Heroku is running your app on that given instance, the database will still be able to get communicated with, even if the database itself lives on a different computer, because the database is configured to have its own like addresses and ports and stuff like that out of the box. That's like why Postgres, if I'm really serious about the app, if I like the idea, if Snoopy on Snails turns into something hilarious and fun, then I'd like to have a way to deploy it. And so I tend to start all of my Rails builds with a -d PostgreSQL, because I never know when I'm going to hit a fun idea and want to actually like get it up on Heroku. Yeah. So yeah, I did -d PostgreSQL in the generator up here. So we did Rails new Snoopy on Snails --API to turn it into the API style app. This is the main thing for today. But then other stuff, I configured the database here with the -d flag, and then here I did -- skip active storage and skip action mailer, which keeps the Rails routes from generating for either of those things. Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. There's other like Rails API stuff. And the documentation for this README is actually a pretty decent thing to read through and go through on a solo pace too, because it's pretty nicely step-by-step. And that I'm trying to demonstrate it for now just to see how well the step-by-step process works, to kind of preview it too. Let's see. We're in here in Snoopy on Snails. What's the other thing that we're supposed to check the difference in? Controllers, application controller. Oh, so we're inheriting our controller from something different now. Let's examine that. Controllers, application controller. Look at that, it's just action controller API. So instead of having the whole action controller, we have this like small subset of action controller as the thing that we are inheriting from. So like just to kind of show that like the idea here is that if all I really need is a scooter in terms of like our MVP kind of stuff, if all I need is a scooter from the Rails portion of my application, I don't want to bring a whole stretch limo there. Just give me the scooter. Just give me the stuff that I need to be an API that knows how to respond to requests at different routes, right? So cool, we're a little bit less bulky now. We're going to generate a controller using a different syntax than the one that we've used before, because with APIs we have this concern called versioning, right? So the idea is that we update our API code, same as we'd update any other code, but since APIs are designed to get hit by things making requests to them, if we're not willing to constantly handhold people and give them active support when they cannot migrate their code to work with our API when we upgrade it to version 2, it would make more sense to have like a copy of version 1 that stays online and then create a whole different set of endpoints under API v2 so that we can have two versions running concurrently next to each other, and then users that haven't yet migrated to the new stuff, we can give them a deprecation warning, right? Like, hey, v1's going to go away in 6 months. For now, you can start migrating over to the v2 routes and their new behaviors and return values. So versioning is a pretty big part of the API stuff. There's a link on it with more details, but the important thing to remember here is that when we generate a controller, we can nest it like this, like it's a file path. And so I'm not going to make snails, or sorry, I'm not going to make users. I will make snails. Something about snails always makes me flip it around when I talk about it. All right, Rails G controller, API v1, snails. Boop, 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 boop. So we went into the controllers and it made a subfolder for us, API, and a subfolder v1. And also when it made test files, it also nested those. So we can go and see what the snails controller looks like when they first make it. API, v1, snails controller, and we can see that this is also stored under this API v1 kind of class nomenclature, separating it from other snails controllers that might belong to other API versions, right? Because we want to be able to run multiple controller versions out of this app for the snails controller as the API grows over time. So that's the kind of versioning part of the concern, right? So cool. Now let's see if we can create a model for snails real quick. Rails G model, snail, name, shell color, diameter. Cool. Rails DB migrate. I'm not even going to look. I just trust myself. Of course. I ruined it. With my hubris. Oh, the database doesn't exist. Sure. Rails DB create. Can't migrate to something that's not there. I just checked my Postgres instance 48 hours ago to make sure everything was up and running. Rails DB migrate. Margate. Boop, boop. Then we'll go into the console and make a snail. Shell color. Diameter. Nope, diameter 2. How about that? Something like that. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Cool. So we've saved Roxy, right? We've got our API controller. We have a model there, right? So now we're guiding ourselves through this process, right? Trying to attempt to have like, what is our workflow for now that we've created this API? We've got the app, we've got a controller, I've got a model, I've saved something to the database. What happens next, right? We want to make sure that we get to this controller and let's see if we can like see the data, right? Show the data that we see, some JSON object. Well, let's see. In our controller, can we make like an index page for the snails? Snails controller, def index. End. This is a Rails backend, right? So if I have index, that means I'm going to need a route for it. So we could say resources, snails. only index for now. And let's see what pieces we're missing, because I bet we're missing a couple. I shut down the shirtsy server. Let's start a server for this. Hop over and take a peek. Localhost 3000, snails. Uninitialized constant snails controller. Something's amiss. Does anybody have an idea what it could be? Yeah, nice. Oh, I didn't specify data type on name. Name defaults to string when you're naming those attributes. That's why. So here's the problem. I've got this API nesting, right? When I created the resource, I called it API v1 snails, right? But then I created a model called snail, and I was thinking about the model I made, and then I said, like, resources snails. I think I might have to do something like this. I think we might have to nest this inside of an API. Something like this. See if this works. It might not. Let's see how rusty I am. Let's try our Rails routes. Let's see if we have a route that's nested in name to match up with our controller. Ooh, interesting. Look at this. We have API v1 snails. I don't think that's exactly what we wanted. Where could I look? Let's check this out. Let's look for Rails. Rails route API v1. Building awesome Rails APIs part 1. API versioning for Rails routes. That's kind of what I'm thinking about. How do we API version our Rails routes? Yeah, we're trying to do this various stuff that they're trying to do. API scope. API version 12. Let's see what we got here. So instead of saying resources, which created this nesting pattern, right? Where like it thought that v1 was a thing for real, but v1's not a thing with an ID. API is not a thing with an ID, right? API and v1 are just words that I want to use. So instead of saying resources, I could say namespace. So now we have namespace API, namespace v1, and then resources for the actual thing that we want. Let's see what those routes look like. API v1 snails. Okay, so now I feel like we have a route that's going to actually catch. Let's serve something. API v1 snails. Completed 204 no content. But hey, that's okay. We had a 204 no content. I think that if we said some way to respond, right, in the controller, say like at snails equals, well, do I need an instance variable? I don't have a view anymore. Snail.all .2JSON? I don't know. Let's see. Refresh. Oh yeah, I went to the wrong page again. Shirts, snails, where'd my API v1 call? Oh well, let's try this again. API v1 snails. I missed something. Let's see. Processed API v1 snails. Maybe I need to respond with JSON. I don't think I'm going to render in this case because the response out of the method, I think, just by being itself, I don't think there's rendering because there's not a view that I'm putting together. I think that I just really want to send back the 2JSON stringified response as the actual response. So I'm trying to say here more explicitly that if I say maybe format.json and make my browser make a JSON request, then I will return the value of snail.all.2JSON, and then I think I could end this and try it with the JSON. So we'll do that. API v1 /snails.json. asking specifically for that in my response. Undefined method respond to for API v1 snails controller. Did I mean respond to question mark? I don't think I meant respond to question mark. Let's see. What did I miss? Let's go back and check. We'll go back here. We need to specify the shape. Yeah, other specifications. Yeah, let's see. Serialize. Yeah, how are we going to exactly get this stuff out, right? Oh, yeah, I think that render is what we want. Render JSON. Let's do that. Render JSON. Nice catch. Zookeeper backend is my README. Snoopy on snails. Let's get rid of the response to, because I think all we have is the API stuff. Say render JSON. We'll check, yeah. And it looks like here we have something similar to our route syntax, right? Like this reminds me very much of like whether I'm doing a route and saying I only want like index and show, or whether I'm in a controller and saying like except for these two methods when I'm doing like a before action. And so here I think that include here, by the way, is the keyword if we have associated objects, right? So if the user like has many tweets, right, then we'd use the piece here. Yeah, and we don't need to have the toJSON, right? Jason's exactly right. We don't need to define the toJSON here at the end because snail.all is the object that JSON is expecting and ready to convert. Let's take a look at what this is. Had a 500. Let's dial it down a bit. Yeah, there we go. Snails.json, Roxy, purple, number 2. Nice, Derek. Cool. So that's like API response, right? In terms of like configuring the controller. We have our render JSON happening in the controller itself. In our routes, we have our namespace to make sure that things are nested in. Let's see, could we actually hit this route now at this point? Like, we've done it from here, right? Is it possible for me to maybe create something? I want to make a fetch request to this spot from somewhere. So I'm going to go, I don't know. Let me do it from here. Open up this Mozilla console. Okay, let me try to do a fetch here. Fetch to localhost API v1 snails.json. And then something like that, right? Why not? That might not be exactly it. Let's see. Ooh. Okay, I got a promise. Check this error out. Access to fetch at localhost 3000 API v1 snails JSON from origin https developer mozilla.org has been blocked by CORS policy. Well, dang it. Does anybody know what CORS stands for? Anybody? Yeah, it's a cross-origin request, or I'd say more specifically, I think it stands for cross-origin resource sharing. I mean, yeah, cross-origin request is going to be like when I'm requesting a resource, I'm requesting a resource from somewhere else, right? So here I am on Mozilla's page. This is actually the page for CORS, right? It covers like some issues where we'd have some problems. Let's say that like I had a banking app, right? And I was letting somebody go from like their MySpace page and write JavaScript in their console to try to make a withdrawal from the banking app, right? My banking app at minimum should have some security saying anybody who's trying to make a put request on somebody's account balance had better be making that request from within the app itself. If that call's not coming from inside the house, I don't want to trust it. This is the app that's basically saying if you're not coming from localhost, like we're not going to let you in, right? The CORS is basically a law that we write into our software that basically says if I don't tell you that you can come in here, then you can't come in from somewhere else. And so Rails is built to kind of be locked down by default, and we can play around with that setting, and that is also covered in the README here. So we just made this failed fetch request, right? We just talked about cores a little bit. So we have our gem file, and there is a rack cores gem that's kind of like queued up for us that we can play with here. Gem file, rack cores. Uncomment this. We got to run bundle again when we do. Sick. Where's our rack cores? Oh, there it is. Somewhere up here. That was rack test. Psyched myself out. It's in here somewhere. There it is. Using rack cores. So we've successfully added rack cores to the project that way. Once we've added the rack cores, then we actually go to this app config initializers cores.rb, and there's some settings here. So I'm going to take this like block and I'm going to compare it with the block that's going to be in there when we get there. So we'll go to cores.rb in config initializers. Initializers are like all the stuff that runs when the app first boots up and like sets itself up. So here's what we had, right, as like the boilerplate, and let's compare it to what we're actually going to use here. In here, it's going to say that like we're going to allow certain origins. So this is me whitelisting or allow listing rather. Like I'm basically creating a list of sites that I will let requests come from. So if I'm like the Chase banking app, I might accept requests from like chase.com and chasemobile.com and authorizedchase.org or something like that, and futurechase.gov. Etc. And so we have like various things we could add in here as a list of origins. Resource is going to talk about like what kind of resource you're going to be allowed to return, and we're saying star for like any type. We're taking any type of headers here and saying methods get, post, put, patch, delete options, and head. So any sort of like HTTP method that we could expect to hit any sort of like resource that's requested via URL and from any given origin. This is a very, very permissive policy, right? We would never keep this open in a real production app because it would let anybody just like wreak havoc on our server if they knew even the first bit about Postman, right? So ideally what we're trying to do here is just create a situation where for now we can open up the gates, try this fetch request again, and see if it's more successful than it was last time. Because you'll have to do this on your projects as well, right? You'll have to make sure that your front-end code is able to actually talk to your back-end. Fetch. So promise. Resolve. Oh yeah, I forgot to, hang on a second. One more. There's Roxy. So we got our stuff back to the front end now. Now I've created the separation, right? I've got my Rails backend. My Rails backend knows like exactly what it's doing. My Rails front end is now able to talk to the backend and talk to the backend the same way that it was, right? We just had to create a new namespace for our route, and that's included in that. This is just a kindness to the user, right? This would have worked without any of the namespacing stuff, but it would be much harder to maintain without making some current user upset when I change how things behave at a given route. Yeah, so I'm wondering, did people have any questions about the stuff that we just went through in terms of setting up a Rails application as an API, using the render JSON as opposed to just render to send back JSON objects? Or the reason why like we couldn't fetch before we allowed the cores setting? Those are kind of the main things. It's really kind of taking some of the Rails stuff that we know how to do and tweaking it a little bit. And so I'm also going to upload this Zookeeper backend, which has the README that I just kind of like worked through today, as well as the Zookeeper front end. And so we've got these two different apps that know how to work together, and I can just kind of demonstrate that too for a second. If we go here and I keep my, here's why, because Snoopy on Snails was all by itself, right? But if I'm doing Zookeeper, now we're back at it, right? Back end on the left, this is how it's done. And I didn't make the rules. I did, it's arbitrary, but I didn't. But anyways, we have Rails S loads up, we have Zookeeper front end, and there's some code in here, right? And in our code is an index.html. And then that's connected to this like animal.js, right? And we have this like animal class, which knows how to take in some data, and based on the data, it knows how to print out like name, gender, and species off of things. This is like slightly more advanced stuff that's going on in here, but I think it's kind of fun to play with. Let's see, when we have our index here, let's see if we can make a request. Index, finder to Chrome. Open her up. Cool. So let's refresh. Here's our zookeeper front end. Animal name, animal gender, add animal. We have two animals here, Balto and Maria, right? So like what's happening on our back end? Like what routes do we actually have here? Let's check and see. Zookeeper backend, Command T, new tab, Rails routes. Where can we go? So we have get animals, post animals, and get animals by ID. So I'm wondering what animals we actually have in the database. Let's see. Animal.all. No animals? Oh no. Let's just look at what it means to be an animal. It's got a name, it's got a gender, it's got a species ID. Do we have any species? Well, that won't do at all. Hang on a second. Do I have anything seeded? I might have to make one of each, just to be sure. Oh. Okay. We'll make a species first because the animal does belong to a species, right? Species.all, just to kick it, then just call on species. Figure out what we got. It's got a name. That's it, right? So species.create. Ape will be the name. Yeah. Cool. And then we'll make an animal. And that had a name and a gender and a species. Name, Joe Young, gender, male, species, ID will be 1. Cool. So we got an animal. The animal belongs to a species. Let's see if we have our zookeeper front end up here. We have our index.html. We check and see, do we have like our JavaScript included in our index.html? Sure. We're not actually worried about like the order of operations here in terms of like waiting for the whole document to load in index.js. But check out the order here that we have like animal.js, and then it wants to include something called API.js, and then index.js. Let's see. Where is my API.js? Y'all, I think I'm actually missing a file in this document. Well, let's see what we can do. Let's see if we can make a call. API.js. And I think the job of this file is going to be like serve as the conduit. Connect to the Rails API and handle requests, responses. Handle responses, I'll say. Responses. So I think that what we could start with is once we know what Rails routes we have on a given backend. We had the 3, right? And they were all just based on the animals, right? So that means that like our base URL for everything here is going to be localhost 3000/animals, right? So HTTP localhost 3000 /animals. Let's say constant. So if I have one of these, I wonder if I do fetch to base URL, can I get the animals that I want? Let's try this. No, I'm just going to console log in for now. Let's fetch and see. Inspect. Refresh. Cool. So we're able to make a request to our back end, and we can get the animal through into the front end right here. I think that I'm actually going to call pause on it at this point because I think that we've covered a good bit, and I'm wondering if people have any questions of what we've gone through so far. I will get this code uploaded so that people can continue to play and explore more of what's going on in here, and I might also extend it more with some more API stuff, but I think I had some other notes that I'm not sure where they're at the moment. Questions? I think that maybe, oh, you know what? One thing that we didn't do, I don't think we made a post request, right? We should probably make sure that our post request can go through. And to do that, we need to kind of think about where the post request is going to go. So how is this backend going to need to take in information, right? So our create, we're still going to do like the params species, right? Name param species. So somewhere species name is going to get written down. I think I'm going to need to like provide that like as ape. And then we need to say like animal.create, name params name, gender 2i, and then species is species. So this means that like it feels like I'm just going to need to pass in a flat hash with species, name, gender.
Your screen is not shared.
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you. I hopped off. Appreciate it. Here's what I'm looking at right now. I've got this animals controller that has a species.finder create by that's coming off of param species, and then I also see param's name and I see param's gender. So if I'm thinking about like the object that I need to like JSONify or JSON.stringify and send back to a create route, I'm gonna have to think about the shape of the params. Sometimes I'll nest things underneath like param's animal, like in a typical Rails way. Other times I won't. This is gonna be one of the times that it's not, so I'm gonna need to flex with that. So if this fetch worked from this context, let me see if another one's going to work. If I did a fetch base URL, but now we add our options hash, right? And then we'll say method is going to be post. And then we'll have, oops, that's no good. And then we needed a comma there, and we need a headers. And then this is going to be content type. And then application JSON. I'm not sure. Somebody spot check that one out for me and let me know. Am I even in the ballpark on syntax there? I'm gonna look it up. That's how I remember it from my brain, but fetch post headers. That's what I need. I find the MDN doc, which I like a little more every month nowadays. I like the way that they put their info together. Check. I'd always go down and look at the post example again. Application /JSON. Oh, capital T. I ruined my whole life off of that. Cool. So that's our headers, and then we'd have to have a body, which is going to be animal info. JSON.stringify. Animal info. And then we need to have something called animal info for this to work. And this will be name. Oh, wait. What's the name of the... I don't remember. Kong. And species, it looked like it was going to be found by the name field. So I'm going to say species ape. And this is the wrong syntax. Cool. Probably break this up for readability. Oops. I like that better. Cool. So we have animal info. I'm going to attempt to pass this in with the body being animal info. I'm curious to see what happens here. And then console log. Let's get both of these. just going to call it output as a catch-all, because I don't know if I'm going to get an error or nothing at all, or like the thing that I'm hoping for, which is like evidence that an animal was created by the second fetch. I expect to see Joe Young still in the first fetch when I refresh. Let's see, we go back to our Zookeeper front end, refresh. Post is not defined. I forgot to make it a string, of course. Cool. Make sure. Refresh. There it is. Kong, gender male, created seconds ago with species ID of 1. So the name search thing works just fine. I think that there's definitely more work to be done in this app. I don't have the time necessarily to put all of the pieces together here, but this is a nice fleshed out front end app and a really good way to make sure that you've practiced like fetch calls and maybe trying to figure out also like for code challenge shaped things of, hey, could I make my JavaScript work with some existing boilerplate code? One challenge would be like, once I've created an animal with these 3 things, right? Typing in a species name, putting a gender here, getting the animal name here. Could I use like an API file and then like an animal.js file and an index.js file together to write the logic? And you don't have to put it in all those files. They're designed to help you organize your work into given shapes of jobs. But I think the task here would be when we enter in an animal name and a gender and a species, are we going to be able to click on add animal, send that post fetch request, and then in part of the response be able to get this response wrapped up and rendered on the page underneath our animal list. So yeah, I'll put all this code up, and it's kind of a like a build your own lab kind of situation for future reference. But I think that the README at the very least inside of this Zookeeper backend will do a good job for jogging your memory without having to go back and actually like pull like 3 labs up to get the info. Cool. Any other questions for now? Sorry, I almost forgot the post part at the end there, but that's kind of half the battle. This is also going to really matter when we have like Rails to authenticate things next mod, right? Setting up the API stuff is going to be like the review part, and then we'll extend past it to get into how to use Rails for your authentication, but also have like a front end application to hold on to stuff, because we don't have cookies like in certain contexts later on down the road. Cool. Well, that's all I've got for the time being as far as using Rails as an API. I think that in terms of getting reps in, this is one of those things where the code that needs to be changed every time from your regular Rails build, very, very small amount of code, but the more times that you do it, the easier it is to remember where those pieces are, and the less times that you have to go and like look stuff up by hand. Although, as we saw today, it doesn't take that long to look this stuff up because everybody's coding in Rails and doing the same kind of stuff, and the boilerplate can be looked up in half the Stack Overflow posts out there in the world. Cool. Thanks a lot, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording now, and